Here are 4 examples of how to deal with parentheses, exponents, and negative signs. How to interpret them, how to get them correct, and on the next slide we'll show you an example of doing a problem that involves this kind of situation built into it. So the first one, which is -3 being squared, remember that an exponent applies to what's immediately below and to the left of it. So the first thing that this exponent sees is the parentheses. That's the very first thing to the left. And so what's being squared is whatever's in the parentheses, which means this should be interpreted as -3 times -3. In other words, whatever's in the parentheses is written as a factor twice. A negative times a negative is a positive, so this answer is +9. Now, the second problem, the first thing that the exponent sees is the 3. So what that's telling us is that the 3 is being squared, and then we want the opposite of that answer. In other words, this should be interpreted as the opposite of whatever 3 times 3 is. I'll put parentheses around that. Actually, I'll put those parentheses in a different color so that you can see that we're just using them as an interpretation. And so what we're really saying is we want to square 3, which is 9, and then we want to return the minus sign to that position and say we want the opposite of that. So this is the opposite of whatever 3 squared is, so it's -9. Notice how those two things crucially are different with the parentheses or without the parentheses. Now, the last two problems are more complicated versions of what it can look like with and without with parentheses and with minus signs. So let's interpret these properly. So the third one, the first thing that the 2 sees is the parentheses, which means we are squaring -3. So we continue to write the minus sign. We have -3 times -3, and again I've added the parentheses for emphasis that the first thing that we're doing, since exponents come before addition or subtraction, is squaring what's in the parentheses. So that means -3 times -3, which is +9. So we have the opposite of +9. In other words, this is simply the opposite of the first situation up above. So what we have as a result is -9. Lastly, the first thing that the exponent sees in this case on the fourth problem is the 3. And so we bring the minus sign down. We show the parentheses. We say, oh, we're squaring 3, so it's the opposite of whatever 3 squared is. 3 squared is 3 times 3. So this is actually the opposite of 9, which is, and the opposite of the 9 of 9 is +9. So there are 4 examples of how to interpret these parentheses. And now on the next slide we'll do an example with a couple of things that are similar to this built into it. So here's an example of what we would call a PEMDAS problem with exponents. And we need to interpret each line and write our next line as carefully as possible. So we simply observe that parentheses come first, which means we're going to need to focus inside the big bracket, which means we can rewrite this portion and simply leave that as it was. We have 3 minus, now what's being squared? The very first thing that the exponent sees is the parentheses, which means that what's being squared is -2. So it's 3 minus -2 times -2. Now that looks more complicated than it was, but I'm just showing the interpretation. What that really means is we have this, 3 minus -2 times -2 is +4. And then we bring the other problems down, and we notice that the 2 is outside this parentheses here, and so the first thing that this 2 sees is that parentheses, and therefore we have to do what's inside that parentheses before we can square it. So this is 1 minus negative 3, which is the same as 1 plus 3. And we'll be squaring that in just a moment. So we have 3 minus negative 2 times negative 2, or 3 minus 4, minus now exponents and parentheses combined together to say do what's in the parentheses. So 1 plus 3 is 4, and then we'll be squaring 4. Now I don't need to write the parentheses anymore because we've done everything inside the parentheses. And the 2 is squaring the 4, just as before it was squaring whatever's in the parentheses. So what we have now is 5 minus 2, and we have 3 minus 4 squared. Now, you could do 3 minus 4 now. You can do left to right since they're separated by minus signs. But we may as well follow our PEMDAS or order of operations and say, let's do the exponent first. Now, what's being squared? Only the 4. Remember, the 2 is seeing the exponent of 2 is seeing the 4 first. So the 4 gets squared, not the minus sign. So 4 squared is 16. And therefore, we now have the problem where there are no more exponents. There's simply standard order of operation. 3 minus 4 is negative 1 minus 16. We do this left to right. So then we have 5 minus 2. And in the parentheses, we have negative 1 minus 16. So that's negative 1 plus a negative 16, or negative 1 and then going 16 further down. So that's negative 17. And now we have to interpret what's going on right here. And that tells us that we should be doing an implied multiplication. So we could actually even just rewrite this problem as 5 minus 2 times negative 17. And that will remind us that we're doing a multiplication. 5 minus 2 times negative 17, order of operations, says to do the multiplication first. So that means it's 5 minus positive 2 times negative 17 is negative 34. 5 minus negative 34 is the same as 5 plus the opposite of that, which is positive 34, which gives us 39. Alternatively, we could have looked at this in a different way. We could have said, or 5 plus negative 2 times negative 17. And that can be interpreted this way, where we do the subtraction. We're doing 5 minus some answer. So that's 5 plus the opposite of that answer, which means we're going to do negative. It could also mean that we're doing 5 plus negative 2 times negative 17. So this turns out to be 5 plus positive 34, which also gives us the answer of 39.